Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is our third episode in a very short period of time. So we are back in business, but we'll be taking a holiday hiatus probably after this one. But there's one more that we desperately needed to get in before the holidays, since it's such an important topic, the Soviet roots of contemporary left anti-Semitism. And we have a very special guest who will be introducing herself in a few minutes. And welcome back. We hope you all watched our announcement of the Shmigegi of the year yesterday in a podcast that we posted. And if not, we will be posting the official announcement of that, or it should be up by the time you watch this episode. So I'm Jarrod. I teach Jewish history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And here's my colleague.
I'm Adam Fuller, and I teach political science and Jewish studies at Youngstown State University in Youngstown, Ohio. And now our guest will introduce herself.
So great to be with you both. I'm Izabella Tabarovsky, and I have written a lot lately about the anti-Zionist, Soviet anti-Zionism, which really is the root of a lot of contemporary anti-Zionist, anti-Israel rhetoric. And I don't know, Jarrod, do you want me, and Adam, do you want me to say more about who I am and my background?
Please, tell our audience who you are.
Okay.
An authentic Sovietskaya or Devushka. I'm not trying to, suggest what year you were born in, of course, but please tell us about your roots.
So yes, so I grew up in the USSR, actually lived there for 20 years. So I actually know what I'm speaking about. I didn't learn it from my parents, and I didn't learn about it from books, or a lot of it, certainly Soviet life and Soviet society. But then we moved to the US when I was 20. And then I studied the Soviet Union in college and in graduate school at Harvard. And then I had all kinds of jobs that usually had to do, or always had to do actually, with contemporary Russia. And then I landed at the Kennan Institute, which is part of the Wilson Center. It's sort of a research institute / think tank in Washington, D.C. And I started, and I was already at the time really interested in and focusing on Jewish topics in my own life, and started writing about the Holocaust in the former USSR, because I realized that a lot of people knew the story of the Holocaust that happened, the camps that were placed in Poland and all that, but they didn't really know about the Holocaust by bullets. And that's actually, in fact, where the Holocaust started. And so I wrote a lot about that. And then I started writing, I think one day, in fact, several years ago, I remember watching, I think it was 2018, I was watching a news item on TV where it was what is so common today, but I had never seen that in America. I don't think, maybe I wasn't paying attention, or I don't know, but suddenly there was this item with college protests, people holding the signs, Zionism is Nazism and Zionism is racism. And, and I was so perplexed. And I called my dad and I said, I just saw this piece on TV, and they're saying, they're accusing Israel of all kinds of things, and they're saying that actually they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just being anti-Zionist. And my dad just laughed. He just burst out laughing, and he said, well, that we've heard before. And I thought, yes, we have heard that before. Why is it here in America? I don't get it. And so since then, I started researching, and I really can't stop researching and writing about it, because I find it really dangerous, frankly. And I've said it probably in every article I've written. And in fact, what's happened since October 7th, I think only proves it. So I'll stop here and
Jarrod, we'll get into a deep conversation about this.
Point out that you're in Israel now, right?
I am. Yes, I'm in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll get into it. We're certainly going to get into the nuts and bolts of that, and you have a lot to say about it. I as a trained Soviet historian, have much to say about it as well. And I wanted to just say a few remarks about Soviet Jewish history and Soviet Jewish historiography in general before we embark. The first important thing is that the post-Stalin era for Soviet Jewish history has simply not been written about by historians yet. It's only really starting now. In fact, I just reviewed this wonderful book by Murat Grinberg, a friend and colleague of mine, which I will talk about later a little bit, the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. And he really throws himself into the construction of Soviet Jewish identity after Stalin. Now, the pre-Stalin era, historians have been writing, or the Stalin era, up until the Stalin era, until World War II, Soviet historians have been writing about quite a bit since about the mid to late 1990s. Before that, it was just profound misconceptions about what happened. The Soviet Union was always an anti-Semitic state. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. And just to briefly, let our viewers know before we look at this radical turn the USSR took against the Jews. Now, we all know Russia was an anti-Semitic state before the revolution. Tsarist policy was deeply anti-Semitic. It wasn't simply driven by Jew hatred. There was a whole context to it and whatnot. But still, the Jews were severely oppressed, and that's why 2 million migrated to America before the revolution. It also explains why a disproportionate number of Jews supported the Bolsheviks, right? It was one of the ideologies floating around the Pale of Settlement, like the Zionists. How do we free ourselves from this horrible oppression? How do we get emancipation like our European brothers and sisters did through the Enlightenment? And one way was by supporting the Bolsheviks. And in the interwar era, at least until Stalin really started to think about turning on the Jews did quite well, especially in the 1920s. Communism, whatever they might have been thinking about on the inside, whether they were true believers or not, was a vehicle for them to enjoy social mobility without complete assimilation. They didn't have to abandon their Jewish identity. Did you want to add?
Well, if I could just cut into, or maybe you mean to say it, but so I would say that it was definitely true for Jews who accepted the premise that if they give up their Jewish nationalism and Jewish religion, then they could be fully happy in the Jewish state. If they failed to abandon them, then they were in trouble. But if they didn't, then yes,
absolutely. Make no mistake, this is still a very illiberal state that will shoot people if you don't follow the party line. I'm not claiming otherwise. This was not some sort of radical democratic experiment. But also keep in mind that even in Western Europe, even though they didn't enforce it through guns until we get to the fascist era, it was sort of the same idea. From the French Revolution, when Comte Tonnerre said, to the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a nation, nothing. The Jews were expected to be a certain type of person if they wanted to be accepted by, quote, Western civilization, which I would argue is a 2,000-year-old, offer to the Jews. Give up what you think you are and want to be, and be the kind of Jew we want you to be, and you will be welcome to the club. I think that's a long-standing principle in the way Jews have been treated in the Christian world. So with the Soviet Union, though, the Jews, the extent to which they wanted to give up their Judaism, it's hard to say. The younger generation seemed to be interested in it, much as many of the immigrants to America did. So basically, the offer was Judaism, bad, bad, bad. Zionism, bad, bad, bad. And let's remember, 1920s, Zionism was hardly universally accepted among the Jewish community anywhere in the world. Israel was not a state yet. The reform movement in the US was officially anti-Zionist until the 1930s, like very publicly so. So that's not that uncommon. And it's also not uncommon because this applied to every single minority in the USSR. Come and join the Soviet family. This is not a new Russian empire in disguise, even though it kind of was in certain ways. But you can be a true Soviet nation. Your culture will flourish, and you will enjoy mobility, accepting the fact that this is a one-party state, and you have to follow what we say. And if you don't do it, well, you could end up in the Gulag, and then under Stalin, you will be shot. But for the Jews, this meant leaving the Pale of Settlement, going to Moscow, going to Petersburg, intermarrying if they want, learning Russian, or continuing to speak Yiddish. So Hebrew, bad, bad, bad. Language of Zionism and rabbis. Yiddish, the language of the working class. Let's elevate Yiddish. And the Soviet Union in the 1930s, boasted of easily one of the best Yiddish theaters in the world at the time. That, along with Warsaw and the United States.
Of the Year awards?
Sorry, what?
They give out any Schmagegi of the Year awards?
The USSR?
Yeah, if they were Yiddish.
No, they just rounded you up and sent you to the Gulag. I don't think that they were big on the whole award front. So the Soviet Union, especially under Lenin and in the early days of the Stalin era, it wasn't, I will preface this by saying it was bad to be in the Soviet Union full stop, no matter who you are. But within the concept of living in this horrible place, being Jewish was actually not so bad. The Jews benefited immensely in the Russian context from the revolution. And that needs to understand. Even in the Great Terror, when Stalin, for reasons scholars still haven't fully been able to explain, rounded up millions and sent them to the Gulag and shot hundreds of thousands. if you look at the stats, yeah, Jews and a few other nationalities were disproportionately attacked, but that's not because they were Jewish. It's because they occupied the leading ranks among the political elite and the cultural elite. And this was a war against the elites as Stalin made his revolution. So that's not to say they didn't occasionally use anti-Semitic propaganda. You look at the posters from the time and they all look like Trotsky, but that's because they were all called they were all called Trotskyists. So yeah, there is a way of leveraging anti-Semitic tropes in the service of something that isn't quite anti-Semitism. And, I don't want to get caught up in semantics. The upshot of it might still be anti-Semitism. But then things changed. Stalin turned on the Jews for complicated reasons after World War II, a lot of it having to do with the founding of Israel and it ending up in the American camp, coupled with Stalin's extreme paranoia and the rise of Jewish nationalism because of the Great Patriotic War against the Germans. Stalin allowed national minorities to express their nationalism just to achieve the victory. The Jews did. And then after the war, they had this heightened consciousness. Golda Meir visited, this is a very famous story, visited the USSR, or came to the USSR as the first ambassador from Israel when the USSR was still on good relations. And the crowds met with her outside of a synagogue, and they were singing "Next Year in Jerusalem," which of course has been a Jewish chant for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's not really nationalism. It's a spiritual statement in many respects. But if you're Joseph Stalin, that's like, okay, you want to leave here, you want to go join the enemy. This is not good. Why are there all these bad people surrounding me, all these Jews? Turned on the Jews. Stalin died, anti-Semitic campaign was shut down, and then Jews were not supposed to be talked about again. And then we walked into the post-war era and the emergence of anti-Zionism as official policy. And it's in this era that the Soviet Union became anti-Semitic, guised as anti-Semitism. So I've said my piece about the pre-war era so people understand the concept. We can't just simply draw a straight line from Tsar Nicholas II, the card-carrying anti-Semite, to Khrushchev and Brezhnev. There's a lot of complications in the in-between period, and it makes sense why you read memoirs of Jews in the 20s and the 30s, and it's like, yeah, life isn't necessarily great here, but we're trying to build something, and they're not targeting us for the first time. So I will turn.
Yeah, and I just want to say that in fact, the Soviets, speaking about Zionism versus anti-Zionism, so the Bolsheviks were anti-Zionist always, but the quality of their anti-Zionism changes, just as you say also, like as the quality of general anti-Semitism changes, the specific kind of evolution of anti-Zionism also changes, because if you look at what Lenin wrote, at Stalin's early writings, they're anti-Zionist, but they have theory for that. They have Marxist theory for that. They claim that Zionists are wrong on theory. And that they also had practical reasons for the Zionists not to want to distract Jews from the struggle for the revolution. They felt like Zionists wanted to distract Jews from this collective effort because Zionists' idea was different, right? It wasn't that. What the internationalists were saying, what the socialists were saying, is that proletariat in the UK is closer to the proletariat in America and in Russia and elsewhere and in Germany than to their own bourgeoisie. And the Zionists were saying something else. They were saying, Jewish poor are close, or Jewish workers are close to other Jews because they're Jews. It's a nationalist ideology. And so Lenin and Stalin would say, well, they're wrong, and Zionists also wrong, because Jews are not a people, they're not a nation for these and this, and they had all kinds of, they had reasons for that, to say that. Okay, that's fine,
I just want to add that the same debate was happening in the West among Jews and among non-Jews. I had a grad student who wrote a wonderful paper last year looking at the shift in anti-Zionist discourse from pre-1948 to after 1948. And before 1948, it was a legitimate debate. Are we a religion or are we an ethnic group? Is our path forward to be just a different denomination of a people in whatever state? Obviously, the Soviet Union was atheist, so it's slightly different there. But in the West, or do we chart our future with an ethno-national state? There wasn't one yet, right? But once fascism became a reality and the doors were closed to immigration, it became it. But anyway, she showed after 1948 that what had been just a debate about Jewish statehood or no Jewish statehood After 1948, it became imbued with all these anti-Semitic tropes, right? About Zionism representing
That's right.
Jewish power, et cetera, et cetera. It was as if the Zionists picked up the program of what had been right-wing anti-Semitism before the war. Just
Well, that's
emphasizing
right.
Zionism.
That's exactly it. So in the late Stalinist period, Stalin's anti-Semitism had very strong anti-Zionist notes because he became really paranoid about Israel. But what's different about that as compared to early Soviet anti-Zionism is that it, yes, acquires these conspiracist notes. And then, when you get to post-67, which is what I focus on, and it's not like there is no anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in between. It's just a 67, then, between Stalin's death to 67 represents such a major turning point because that's when Soviet anti-Zionism turns really full-on conspiracist. They're really talking about it's an anti-Zionist conspiracy theory that Zionists control everything in the world, and it becomes international. Until then, I would say under Stalin, it was still primarily internally focused, but then after 67, it really becomes international.
The important thing, though, between Stalin and, let's say, Khrushchev, is that Stalin was preparing to round up hundreds of thousands, if not more, Jews and send them off to the Gulag. So it might not have been specifically, that was outright anti-Semitism, Zionism or not, in Stalin's last 3 or 4 years. He had, all the Yiddish writers shot and this and that. But under Khrushchev, it seemed they took a step back. We're not going to talk about the Holocaust. We're not going to talk about what Stalin did. Let's just kind of move away from that. But we're not going to talk about Jewish stuff at all. And you had the beginnings of this quiet anti-Zionism in the years. And as you say, in 67, there was a major shift. Now, I know part of that shift, of course, was the aftermath of the Cold War, the 6-Day War, and Israel is suddenly viewed as this expansionist state, whereas beforehand it hadn't been among a lot of the people who'd been on the fence, especially countries in Africa, who still saw Israel as a model of liberation in certain ways. That all changed with 67. But how do we explain the shift to that paranoid Israel as global oppressor with all the tropes that we're familiar with?
One question, though, before you get to that.
Yeah.
Asking it as someone that's not very knowledgeable on this subject at all. You two are far more knowledgeable. But was there, despite all the anti-Semitism, any appreciation for the fact, at the very least, that Israel was trying to follow a socialist Marxist model?
That was why the USSR recognized, one of the reasons USSR was one of the first states to recognize Israel, because they assumed, because of its socialist inclinations, it had ended up it might end up in the Soviet camp in the emerging Cold War. I would say that that's probably the extent of it. Why they're socialist, of course, as well. Ben Gurion and company, the people who built Israel, the second Eliaznik, or whatever you want to call them, Eliazniks, they came out of the same environment as Bolshevism. It's the ideologies are overlapping in so many ways. It's leftism, but accentuated with nationalism in the case of the Jews. So there's that interesting commonality. But once it became clear that that they were going to be in the American camp, irrespective of their socialist inclinations, I mean, that was it. It was a done deal at that point. I'd also point out that Ben Gurion was militantly anti-communist, right? He was socialist, but anti-communist, and there's a long definition of that. And one of the reasons he brought the religious parties into his early coalitions is he had two nemesis he wanted to keep out: Herut, the future Likud party, and the communists, who were very popular in Israel in the early days. So they took an what we could call an anti-Soviet stance fairly early on. So I think it was pretty dead. It was dead in the water, especially with the Cold War, pretty early. That's my 2 cents. Jeffrey Herf has written a lot about this in his recent book on the making of Israel. I forget the exact title, but it looks at diplomacy and the various state actors.
The Israel moment. No, exactly. And already, and I think that's what contributed also to Stalin's turn away from Israel. Within a year, really, he understood that Israel was not going to be joining the socialist camp. And then already in the 50s, you start to see the Soviet press attacking Israel during the Suez Crisis. And then, because at that point under Khrushchev, the USSR starts to get close to the Arab states. And so they begin to attack Israel. And then during the Eichmann trial in particular, there is a really fascinating episode. The whole thing is very fascinating from the point of view of how the Soviets treated the Eichmann trial, they really hated the fact that Israelis were doing it because they were afraid that Israel would pull away from what the Soviets wanted to be kind of their exclusive ownership of victimhood after World War II, because that was one of the things that they really wanted and felt they achieved with the Nuremberg trials. You know, the idea that really the Nazi Germany attacked the USSR because it was communist and because they hated the Slavic people. That was the Soviet stance. And then suddenly you have all these Jewish victims testifying, and suddenly there's a very different picture is emerging. So the Soviet press is attacking Israel all the time throughout the trial. And yeah, so it's already in the 50s and early 60s, it's already very negative,
I should point out the USSR did play a major role at Nuremberg, and Stalin, I heard a presentation on this like 25 years ago from a Soviet historian. Stalin was orchestrating it. He was like directly involved with his delegates that were over there. And the Holocaust was not mentioned at Nuremberg. It was absolutely not like the evil of Nazi Germany. It wasn't a subject of discussion yet. It was crimes against humanity, including those against the Jews. And neither the US nor Soviet Union wanted to make it about the Jews.
Yeah, absolutely.
So back to 67, what happened?
Yes. So in 67, of course, Israel wins over the Arab states. And the Arab states are at that point financed and trained. The Arab armies are financed and trained by the Soviets. And the Soviets really, it was a real shock for Moscow that they lost. You know, Soviet propaganda, if you read, you know, Soviet press in the run-up to the war, I mean, there was a total expectation that that Israel would lose should the war break out. And then Israel wins. And so, and they are trying to explain to themselves what happened. How could Israel have won? It makes no sense to them. And at that point, what I think happens is that you know, you talked about Stalin, you know, Soviet political culture was always conspiracist, right? It's what happens in a totalitarian state. And so a conspiracist mindset kicks in. And I think that they start to connect the dots. You know, you can connect the dots in the right way, or you can connect them in a completely conspiracist way. And they start looking around the world and they say, well, first of all, Israel must have won because the US supported it, which wasn't the case in 67. But they say, of course, America supported Israel because they want a stronger foothold in the Middle East. It's a crucial area. Also, look at America. There are Jews in all the key places. There are Jews in politics, and there are Jews at the, you know, in Congress, and there are Jews in, you know, owning the banks or running the banks, and there are Jews who own the media. And look at all the Jews with all of their synagogues and all of their multiple organizations. And also at this time, it's important to note that the Soviet Jewry is really inspired by Israel's victory. And so a movement begins for, you know, where Soviet Jews actually want to learn more about their Jewish identity. They suddenly realize that you know, their Jewish identity can be a source of pride and not just a source of shame. So they want to learn more about Israel. They want to learn Hebrew. They want to understand what is Jewish culture, because all they know is that they are just being discriminated against as Jews. And it turns out that there is this country that won this big war, and it's a Jewish country. So, and then, of course, also a movement in the West emerges in support of Soviet Jews. So you know, so the Soviets connect all of it, and they say, wow, look at this. There's a conspiracy there, and it's acting against us. You know, there are these Jews who are Zionists, who support Israel, who also who are trying to like build bridges with our Jews and say that our Jews are related to them, and somehow our Jews are related to Israeli Jews. So they feel like it's an attack. Not only have they lost in their kind of external political interest, but also internally they're being undermined. And so they begin to, they feel like they need to create a really, really big response, right? Because this Zionist enemy is everywhere. And part of their response is propagandistic and, you know, active measures, disinformation. And this is when they begin to put together all of this vocabulary that we see today, whose goal really is to demonize Israel and Zionism and undermine them in that way.
Yeah, so it's I mean, is it utilitarian on the Soviet government's part, or is there a genuine current of Jew hatred that's going on here? Because I mean, obviously, I mean, the Nazis, you know, running the banks and this and that. I mean, we've heard all that before. The difference, of course, is that by the late 1960s, yeah, the Jews were highly successful in the U.S. and had positions in government. Whereas in the 1950s, they didn't, and certainly not in the 30s. I mean, you know, the old joke with the two Jews sitting in a Berlin cafe in like 1934, reading a newspaper, and one of them is reading a Jewish newspaper and one's reading Der Stürmer. And you know, the guy looks at his friend and said, "Why the hell are you reading that anti-Semitic crap?" He said, "Well, your newspaper says that the world's suffering depression, the Jews are getting persecuted, we're all suffering. And in my newspaper here, we're running the banks, we're controlling governments. I mean, this is wonderful. You know, wouldn't I rather read about this?"
We control the world, yeah. Right. Well, I think that it was in a way utilitarian in the sense that I don't think it was driven by Jew hate. I don't think that the policy was driven by hatred of Jews. I really don't. However, you know, they did see it as they had foreign policy objectives, they had domestic policy objectives. They did see it as a security threat, for sure. You know, they would look at there was a lot of Soviet literature printed that tried to present essentially everything related to Israel as being run by the intelligence services and being connected to the CIA and to MI6. But you know, because the apparatus that made decisions about it and created and developed the material and distributed the materials was so big, there were definitely people within it who were driven by personal anti-Jewish animus. That is for sure.
Yeah.
And so they drew on literature, on anti-Jewish literature, in creating this propaganda.
And you know, a good point here to make is that, you know, the people were either signaling to anti-Semites in society, which is what a lot of people on the left today do, and we'll get into that. But it's also that a lot of these, you know, genuine anti-Semites have made their way into government after, and you know, a lot of historians writing on the USSR in the 80s and 90s started to point this out, even earlier. Michel Levine or Moshe Lewin, who pronounced his name in 12 different ways, you know, really showed that what ended up happening, you had these very, you know, quote, progressive Bolsheviks at the top in the 1920s who were going to build this, you know, wonderful egalitarian society through violence, you know, absolutely. But you know, they decriminalized homosexuality, they legalized abortion. I mean, they were really at the vanguard of all these, you know, leftist policies in the world. And then the Stalinists took over. Right? It brought mobility was given to the Jews, but it was also given to the masses, to the Narod, you know, to the rank and file Russian peasantry and Ukrainian peasantry, where the bottom line is the roots of anti-Semitism are deep and go back, you know, centuries to, you know, the Polish era, at least the 1600s. So those people eventually took over, right? They rose up and they were in the regime. So there were people who grew up with anti-Semitism in their environment who ended up becoming the future leaders of the Soviet government. And they were not only then signaling it to other anti-Semites in society or people who they thought would be, for whom anti-Semitism would resonate, but they probably had a strong dose of it themselves from having been exposed to it in their families in the previous generation. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind also. The old Bolsheviks were gone, right? I mean, their influence and their fight against anti-Semitism, which they even pursued in the 20s, completely gone, you know, completely vanished.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, some of them still kind of remain. They're not really necessarily in positions of power, but what you do see, I think, in the 60s, in the late 60s and 70s, as this campaign gets going, is that the government does begin to receive letters from Soviet citizens who say that, wow, you know, you're putting out anti-Semitic propaganda, you know, stop doing this. Or like I'm a veteran, you know, typical kind of Soviet letter. I'm a veteran who fought in World War II with the Nazis, and now you are saying these things that sound like Nazi propaganda. And inside the government, there's actually, you know, inside the Brezhnev kind of circle, there are discussions about, what are we putting out? There are actually people who are saying, yeah, it's too anti-Semitic, or, you know, but eventually, and some of these discussions, and we can get to that, but, you know, eventually they also include, not eventually, but very early on, they start to include the academia in producing these materials. And inside the academia at some point, there also begin to be discussions about, you know, that this is not scholarly, this is not scientific. They would say, you know, it's anti-Semitic.
If only our academics would listen to that today, but they don't.
Well, listen, nobody listened either. I think that they understand that they have a problem on their hands, but they still continue. They continue until the very end, until the late 80s, and the question for me is why? I think that there was an understanding that they were putting out, and by the way, the West never missed an opportunity to point out to them that they were being anti-Semitic and that there is campaign for Soviet Jewry and all that. It's really a big issue in the Cold War. But I think they continued in part maybe because they really believed in it, but also I think because it was such an effective instrument for them. I think that it served the purpose that they needed it to serve, which is to create alliances, in the West among the far left and also in the developing world. I think that they just found that this kind of language united everybody, the whole motley crew of their, fellow travelers around the world.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about the similarities in the relationship between Soviet anti-Jewish propaganda post-67 and what we see in the West. And you in the articles you've published, I should point out Izabella has published at least 2 great pieces on this, showing the discursive link through images and some text. I'll probably, should my video skills be sophisticated enough, I'll probably flash a few of them in some of the black spot on the screen while she's describing some of it. In terms of, the Soviet Union and the left, without leaving the Jews aside here, I mean, everyone's known about the relationship, going back to the 70s with people like Angela Davis. This is well known, right? So there's been an overlap, but it's only now that people like you are really showing how the anti-Semitism in today's left is disturbingly similar in many respects to Soviet and anti-Semitism. Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So, where do you want to start?
Okay. Well, what is it about in terms of, let's talk, we could tackle it from a number of different ways, but in terms of rhetoric and practices, ideological practices, what they're advocating for in this and that, what are the similarities between today and the USSR? Obviously, drawing a direct causal relationship would require archival work in Russia, which is not going to happen, as Jeffrey Herf put it, for many, many decades to come. But there is clearly this discursive link. So let's talk about that a bit. And you've written, extensively about this.
Yeah, well, and some of the channels of transmission you can trace even without, because there are other historians that have already made some research, and you can see it. So, for example, the Soviets worked with left-wing parties, and you can see in some of the memos that have already been kind of extracted and translated on how they discuss issues related to Jews and Zionism. They had, for example, a very close relationship with CPUSA, the Communist Party of the USA. And we know that there is, at one point, there's one documented instance, for example, of a senior American party operative going to Moscow and specifically requesting help in understanding the Soviet position on Zionism. So this is like early 70s. And they provide him with help. And he, a couple years later, publishes a book, which is now easily available online. He publishes numerous articles, and they all communicate this position. He doesn't say that it's a Soviet position, but the way he argues it and the way he explains it, and even some of the footnotes he uses, you can see that he used Soviet resources.
What's his name?
This is Hyman Loomer. I wrote about him in the Hyman Loomer, Lumer.
Is it in English or in Russian? The book is the book in English or Russian?
The book is in English. Yeah. No, he wrote for the English American audiences. The book is called something like it's a very generic title, something like Zionism and World Affairs, something like that. I mentioned this episode in my article, which is it's a paper called The Demonization Blueprints. If you Google it, people can easily find it.
I don't think I've read that one, so I will be sure to pull it up. Where was it published?
Yeah, it's the Journal of Contemporary Antisemitism.
Okay, all right. I think I downloaded it. I have downloaded it, but I haven't read it. Okay, so I do have
it. Yeah, it's open access. So, and then you see, I also mentioned in that article, you have, for example, a correspondence between the Soviet ambassador Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin, with his superiors in Moscow at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they're discussing how he's supposed to counter the Zionist influence in the United States. It's very detailed, very extensive correspondence. Russian historians, I think, identified it first. So there are channels that you can definitely trace for sure.
I just want to point out how very disturbing that last comment is, because it does imply Zionism is controlling the American government.
For sure.
Which is no different than Mersheimer and Walls, Walls writing their book about the Israel lobby. It's the same idea,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Irrespective of the Israel lobby's relationship with the American government, it's putting the Jews in the driver's seats, right?
Yes.
Driving America.
For sure, it's flamingly anti-Semitic kind of discussion that they're having, Dobrynin and his superiors. It's really just flagrant, Zionist conspiracy theory. Zionists control everything. And there are some truly disturbing bits there where Moscow tells them, well, you have to make sure to kind of drive the wedge between Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews, and also between Zionists and non-Jewish populations, because, so that we can undermine Zionist influence. It's in fact disturbing. We don't know what effect it had. Dobrynin reports that he, established some kind of a propaganda council to counter Zionist propaganda, blah, blah. But, it's kind of Soviet bureaucratic window dressing. We don't know how much he actually did. But the fact that this correspondence took place kind of shows you where their head was with regards to America and Zionism. And then there was also actually the Soviets, we have a memo about that also, openly available, where they discuss how successful they were at placing an article in the New York Times. And that article exists, and, it's filled with these tropes. And so now we get to the, what are the tropes? What is the...
who wrote the New York Times article, or did you?
So it's written by Spartak Beglov, Beglov. So it's also in my demonization blueprints article. So what are the tropes? Like, what do the Soviets propose the world? How do they explain Zion, or how do they portray Zionism? So they basically take every cause that the left cares about and portray Zionism as being against it, and they essentially draw Zionism in the same kind of dark colors as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion portray Jews in. So the Protocols portray Jews essentially as the devil, right? The devil incarnate. And Christian anti-Semitism used to do that. Well, the Soviets are atheists, so they can't bring the devil in. So they portray Zionists as Nazis, basically in their description, Zionism becomes, and you can see it if you just look at, if you even do word counts in Soviet literature, your most frequent associations with the word Zionism will be racism and Nazism and fascism and apartheid and settler colonialism, imperialism. They would talk about Israelis conducting a genocide against the Palestinians, and they would talk about Israelis being neo-Nazi Germany. So the Holocaust inversion, they're already practicing that.
This sounds like an article by Omer Bartov. I mean,
I know, exactly.
How far back does the apartheid charge go? When did the Soviets start using that?
Well, some people, I think you can actually find it already even before 67, already in the 60s. And a lot of this language actually, it doesn't just appear out of the blue after 67. Some of it already appears before. It's just that in 67 is when it all coalesces and becomes this really kind of massive effort, and they all pull it together. So at some point in the 70s, there was a book written, a deeply anti-Semitic book called something with the word apartheid in it, and Israel is an apartheid state or something like that. And that book is well known. It's written by Skurlatov.
And they weren't saying that in the West yet. I don't think that discourse of apartheid had entered much in.
No, probably not. But the Soviets did. They were comparing, and even if they didn't use the word apartheid, it doesn't appear as often, for example, as their comparisons to Nazi Germany. But they constantly do compare and talk about how Zionists are treating Palestinians in the same way as South African whites are treating the blacks. You know, they talked, like, what's really interesting about this is that it's also not only about the tropes, but the stories that are being used, the way history is being twisted. So you would see today's left, if you really follow them closely, today's Inter-Israel left, they will talk about Israel having a relationship with South Africa. And they would say, well, this proves that Israelis are as racist as South Africans, you know, just a diplomatic relationship. Or the story of, for example, Rudolf Kastner, who we can get into, but this is a wartime story of a Hungarian Jew negotiating for the release of Hungarian Jewry with Eichmann. Complicated, controversial story, very difficult story. But what the Soviets do is they take it and twist it to say that it proves that the Zionist establishment collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust, which, you know, no interpretation, actual interpretation of these events can possibly show. But this is what they do. This is the twist. In fact, just today I was looking at one brochure, at one Soviet brochure, where they recounted this episode, and they said that Kastner rescued, you know, he ended up rescuing only like 1,600 Jews, I think. And they said, well, he only rescued Zionist and capitalist Jews. He didn't care about the poor masses. So, you know, so all of this stuff, actually, we see it today being replicated, which is, you know, I mean, somebody asked me recently, well, couldn't someone just come up? You always say that it's Soviet influence, but somebody could have just come independently to the conclusion that Israel is a shady settler colonial state. You know, and my answer to that is, well, could someone sit down at their computer and accidentally produce Anna Karenina? You know, like as they just sit down, they sit down to write a
ChatGPT could
book.
do it. I'm sure, you know.
What's that?
ChatGPT.
Right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. You know, but so the answer is, you know, they probably could, but what are the chances? I mean, the thing is that the left is just repeating with such extraordinary, recreating with such extraordinary fidelity the tropes and the explanatory logic of Soviet anti-Zionism that there is a connection. There is a connection undoubtedly. We just need to clarify better, you know, what it is and how it arrived. My theory is that it just became part of the left-wing thinking in the 70s and 80s, and you know, and remained there, and is being transferred from one generation of the leftists to the next. And perhaps after the Cold War, it was there, but kind of on the margins, because the far left was on the margins, and now it's in the center. It's in the mainstream, rather, and so we're hearing it, and it's starting to dominate.
Yeah, the other aspect also, it's interesting that, you know, I mean, the Soviet Union did practice some form of what the left is doing in terms of what we call intersectionalist social justice. And I want to just clarify again that the way the left uses intersectionality today is a complete distortion of the term's original meaning. And it's used today that, you know, all oppressions are linked, and you know, you have to fight all oppressions and not just one. And if you seem to be on board with one oppression, i.e. Zionism, that means you are in favor of all other forms of oppression. That was a centerpiece. I mean, that was a centerpiece of Marxism, you know, from very early on, right? I mean, that all oppressions are linked. The Bolsheviks before the revolution had very easy answers. Anti-Semitism, it'll disappear when you know, the working class is in power. It's just a bourgeois phenomenon. Religion opiated the masses. It'll disappear as well. I mean, they said that about virtually everything. Nationalism, an ephemeral phenomenon. It'll disappear once we have, you know, the working class. And then at some point, the Jews assumed center stage in the form of Zionism. So Zionism became an oppression that was crucial in this, what we might loosely define this intersectionalist continuum or relationship, interlocking forms of oppression. And for whatever reason, in the West, in the last 20 years or so, Zionism became the most crucial of these pieces. And I wrote in a piece in the Jewish Review of Book that in many ways, the Palestinians have assumed the role that the proletariat, did in 19th century Marxists, that the liberation of humanity is contingent upon the liberation of the Palestinians. And you see that Palestine is a climate justice issue, from Standing Rock to Palestine, all those things where Black Lives Matter, we stand with Palestine and we won't be free until the Palestinians are free. Like, really? Okay, there's been a racism against Black people in this country since whatever the year of the project is, 1689 or whatever it is. So you're telling me that, that the Jews are somehow responsible for this? Okay.
Right.
Yeah, so there is this interlocking relationship with Zionists being centered. And
Yes.
they were centered in the USSR in the same way as well, right?
Well, they were for sure after 67, and there is this blowing out of proportion of the Zionist influence that's really extraordinary, and this is, again, like we can compare to the early years, when Lenin and early Stalin were arguing against Zionism. Yeah, or there was a really great study, also it's in my demonization blueprints article, where somebody looked in the 70s, looked at how Soviet encyclopedias defined Zionism. And so they found that the definition changed over the years and decades. And so in the early 20s, Soviet encyclopedias would talk about Zionism. They would talk about it negatively with a bias, but you could still understand that they were talking about a very limited phenomenon, actually, right? It's a phenomenon that really relates to a very small group of people. There aren't that many Jews, especially in the 1920s. And this limited geographical area. By the time you get to the 70s and 80s, Zionism is this global force, right? Global influence, control the world, control every aspect of everything, corrupt the youth, spy and help all the darkest forces. And it's something that you see today, I wrote another article about this new tablet about this Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism that was established right before October 7th. And you look at their rhetoric and it's completely like this. I mean, it's like you visualize, these octopuses and spiders holding the world in their tentacles when you read about their perception of Zionism. It's really, truly, completely insane. But this is what it is.
And I will put up that image again at this point of the one that you have in your article of the spider from the MayDay parade. And I don't think we need to get into details about why this is anti-Semitism. But what was the Russian quote in that image? Zionism as global imperialism or something like that.
Zionism is a weapon of imperialism.
Right. Yeah. So it's centering Zionism in global imperialism, and importantly, and here again we see the relationship between Soviet discourse and American discourse, capitalism. Right.
Yes.
The speech from that CUNY graduate last year, it's she ended with fight the global war against imperialism, against the global threat of imperialism, capitalism, racism, and Zionism. Right. Which is absurd. I mean, to throw Zionism in that category. You're suggesting that it's taken over the world as capitalism, which means the West, has taken over the world as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. So blown all out of proportion, and we see with images like with the spider, they're using the same visual tropes that traditional anti-Semites have. But what you've said about the links with the memos and all that, that's really fascinating, because it does show that there is a direct influence, of attempting to influence people who are foundational on the left in the United States. And it's not just a discursive link, because, there is a discursive link with 19th century anti-Semitism, but the people who wrote the protocols weren't, sitting around in the Soviet government telling them what to say.
Well, that's right. No, and there are actually, there are specific instructions that you see in some of the memos that talk about, we need to send these our brochures explaining Zionism. We need to send them to Brussels because there will be this conference for Soviet Jewry there, and we need to counter that effort, and we need to send our Soviet anti-Zionist Jews to give a press conference abroad, to the press and tell them what's wrong with Zionism. And if you look at some of the publications, as I've done for the last couple of years, that, for example, Soviet embassies put out, you find the same articles appear in local languages that they were publishing in the USSR. So you can show the links very, very directly. You know, the intentionality is there for sure.
What about campus discourse today? And probably more importantly, the academic establishment, or those fields in the humanities, where you see anti-Zionism, thinly disguised anti-Semitism, as I would argue. Do you see a relationship in the, quote, scholarly perspective in the models that they're using here? And I have in mind just even things like, DEI and stuff like that, and the way that Jews were kept down in the USSR, and their mobility was absolutely constrained. Whereas in the West today, Jews cannot be victims. Therefore, they have no, right to enjoy minority victimhood status. And the ticket for mobility today in the West is minority victimhood status. I mean, I see a disturbing parallel with that as well.
Well, I do too, for sure. I can tell you that in my time in the USSR, everybody knew that there were quotas for Jews at universities. There were universities and departments that would not take Jews. For example, the Soviet mathematics were particularly hostile to Jews. There was actually a really great article about this a few years ago in Tablet. I think it was called Coffin Problems or something like that, where if you were a gifted Jewish math student and you wanted to enter mathematics, you would be given, in the USSR, you had these kind of hands-on entrance exams. And so you would be given a different set of problems to solve than non-Jewish kids. They could tell that you were Jewish, maybe from your documents. Most of the time they could tell from your face. So they would just give you a set of problems that were in fact unsolvable. So, when I was entering, I had, I studied there for 2 years in a college. And when I was considering where to go, I was told, don't even try this, don't even try that. They don't take Jews. And so that very much existed. And so when I look at the DEI today and the quotas and how they're talking about, well, we have too many Jews or we have too many Asians, it's very much reminds me of the USSR, and the idea of equity, where we're looking for equality of outcome for everyone. It's a very Soviet idea. We lived it, and ultimately we know that it doesn't work in the end. I mean, it's such an obvious idea, but it was so obvious in the USSR, is that when you choose people based on anything other than their competence or desire to do work, you just don't get the best outcomes, and so.
And the Soviet Union, they actually practiced it in the 1920s with Korenizatsiya, right, with their nativization policy, which actually benefited the minorities. They said, hey, we're not a Russian empire anymore. We're going to, have affirmative action for Jews, for Uzbeks, for Ukrainians, for Belarusians, for Georgians, for Armenians, for everybody. Right.
Yes.
And so again, a great policy, but it doesn't work in practice, especially when Stalin turns around and starts saying, hey, these minorities have too much power. Right.
Yes.
You have the flip side of it after the war, where the same mechanisms are being used to keep Jews down.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I should say that Jews weren't the only ones whose advancement the government tried to keep back through quotas. So in the late USSR, the Volga Germans were also suppressed. So these were Germans who ended up in the Soviet Union at some point throughout history. And in the wake of World Yeah, exactly. And then in the wake of World War II, they were viewed as potential traitors.
Well, they were all deported. The entire collective was deported under Stalin because they were thought to be traitors. Among
Precisely.
Other minorities. Yeah.
Exactly. So their ability to advance was constrained, and also the Armenians' ability to be advanced was constrained. Because why? Because these groups had connections to the outside world, right? They were part of bigger diasporas. It's the same with Jews. And so the Soviets really feared the groups that had connections to the outside world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that explains the deportation of the Koreans at one point in Soviet history, the diaspora nationalities. But, and again, it shows once again, very close parallels between Armenian and Jewish history in many respects. But again, the Jews were the only ones who were given this disproportionate global power and influence.
Precisely.
The Armenians weren't globalized with controlling the levers of power in the same way that, I mean, no one's ever said the Armenians control the American government, and it would sound
Yes.
absurd if anyone would make such a statement. So
Yes.
that's it's an old story, but the Soviet Union very much used it to its
Yes.
advantage, and again, we still hear it today on the left. Adam,
For sure.
chime in. Do you have any questions? I mean, you know a great deal about today's left. We discuss it regularly on our show, and
I have a different sort of question. How would you explain, or would all this explain one of the reasons why there's so much Zionism among Soviet Jewry today and over the last 20, 30 years?
Excellent question. I'm so glad you asked. I think that it does. I think another reason that Zionists, the Jews, Soviet Jews, former Soviet Jews really connect to Zionism and pro-Israel kind of sentiments and are in fact very pro-Israel is because religion was very hard for Soviet Jews to acquire once they left. I would say that the atheist mindset is the most enduring legacy of Soviet experience for Soviet Jews. It's just very, very hard, you know, because religion was attacked so relentlessly and was so relentlessly mocked that I would say not, I don't know, most, probably true. For most Soviet Jews, it was very hard to connect to religion. But the national kind of affiliation and national connection, it was much easier to understand and to
that's how they were
connect to.
officially defined. They were nationalists.
Precisely.
Zionism was bad. They were still a nation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, precisely, exactly. And it's very interesting because when Soviet Jews first came en masse to the US, which was in the late 80s, early 90s, which is when we also came, I think about 500,000 Soviet Jews came. I think that we as a group were very disappointing for American Jews because, you know, and I understand why, American Jews worked very hard to help free us. You know, it's really, I'm not afraid of this word, really, that's what it was. But then we all came and we didn't join the synagogues and we didn't contribute to charities because it's just not how we were brought up. We didn't even understand that that's what defined you as a Jew. For us, being a Jew, it's just who you were. Like if I have the nose that I have, here, I'll show everyone, you know, then in Russia, there is nothing else that I can be. I can only be a Jew, you know, and with this nose, I don't need to go to a synagogue to prove that I'm a Jew or to maintain my Jewishness. You know,
I love that. That's a great phrase. With this nose, I don't need to go to synagogue.
Well, this is, you know, in the end, this is really how I think a lot of people thought about it. Now, I should say that I eventually did find my way to a synagogue, but it took a lot of work. It really took a lot of kind of rethinking things. But what happened over the last few years is I think all of a sudden it turned out that Russian-speaking Jews, which is the more kind of contemporary way to call this former Soviet, and it's now really the children of Soviet Jews, that Russian-speaking Jews bring a very, very strong, completely unapologetic support for Israel and Zionism. When for so many American Jews, it's difficult. And I think that for the first time, it was really very clearly revealed in May of 21. And since then and into now, I think that there are groups of Russian-speaking Jews that are playing a really important role in kind of pro-Zionist and pro-Israel circles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, about the negative. Oh, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Russian Jews are among the fiercest Zionists, both in the United States and in Israel.
And I write about this in my review of Marat Grinberg's excellent book, you know, that Western American and North and Canadian Jews had these stereotypes about Soviet Jews throughout, you know, the post-World War II era. The first one was, of course, the famous Jews of silence. You know, they're just desperately trying to cling to, you know, these religious traditions that have been erased and they've just been terrorized into silence. And the second one was when they kind of came over, as you say, a disappointment. And I heard the phrase a number of times, they're not real Jews. That's what people said in the 90s once they first got to know them, which really what they meant is that, well, they're a different kind of Jews and we don't really recognize their Jewishness. But 20, 30 years later, it's abundantly clear that they define their Jewishness in many respects, different from ours, but overlapping. And, you know, one of the key elements here is fierce support for Israel.
Are you noticing any generational differences? Like, is this tapering off with Gen Z?
Well, here's what I think is happening. I certainly see enough Russian-speaking Jews in the chattering classes, in the kind of who grew up to be writers, whose voices you hear on social media, who are anti-Zionist. They essentially grew up to be uh, kind of standard representatives of, I would say, liberal, progressive, kind of East Coast Jewish intelligentsia. This is how I would put it. But then you have, and I don't know the percentages, but then you have a lot of Russian-speaking Jews. Maybe there was, this is somebody said this to me recently, who actually started, I think this was her, who started or is part of a really excellent Russian speaking Jewish organization that's doing a lot of work on behalf of Israel now. So one of the members said to me, I looked at myself and I look at these people who are also Russian speaking Jews but are anti-Israel. And I thought, well, I think it's because I didn't go to elite universities and my friends didn't go to elite universities. We live in Brighton Beach and on Coney Island, and so this may be the difference, in fact, that the Russian-speaking Jews who just kind of went a more typical immigrants path, went into professions, didn't go to elite colleges. They're more connected to their roots, to what they learned from their families, and they know their family's history. And they know that Soviet anti-Semitism was anti-Zionist, and they have to stand up for Israel.
There are a handful, in Jewish spaces, radical activism and academia, who are just so gung-ho about becoming, really, centerpiece, symbolic, front and center anti-Zionist. I mean, there's one twerp that I could name that I won't bother mentioning his name. There's
we're all thinking of him, I think, at the same
twerp of the year. Yeah, of course. He's so outspoken with his anti-Zionism. Masha Gessen is to a certain extent, though she wasn't really doing that stuff until recently. And then the worst is Raphael Shimunov, one of the founders of If Not Now. I mean, these are people who obviously can't identify with their Soviet origins because it's just undeniable what the USSR did to the Jews in the post-World War II era. And at the same time, they really seem to hate everything that the West represents, and more particular, what Israel allegedly represents. So for these younger people, I guess the Soviet experience is just not fresh in their mind. They were too young, and they found their way in academia. Ticket of admission to the cool club in academia is to sign off on anti-Zionism. But some of them are just so militant, about it's beyond that. It's not just about acceptance.
In fact,
I think that
they even think that Israel is like the Soviet Union or behaves like the Soviet Union.
Well, yeah, and the thing about them, I think that I think that it testifies to the issue of anti-Zionism being a social pursuit, essentially. I think I'm quoting someone, I just don't remember who. I apologize if somebody who said this phrase is watching this now. It's in the sense that if you are part of a certain circle or want to be part of a certain circle, then you adopt this identity and you go with it. Masha Gessen is the essay in the New Yorker. I just found it, I found it so bizarre, because in an interview about this article, Gessen talks about how, and they use the they them pronouns. So I'm going to honor that, that they left the USSR at 14. They knew that their parents were experienced anti-Semitism and couldn't get into schools that they wanted to get into, and so it's just fascinating to me that they don't take it further to understand what form that anti-Semitism took. Anyway, maybe we shouldn't, because if we get into it, we have to explain to the viewers what the article was, because not everybody read it.
It's too convoluted, and I don't think she's a particular. I don't think they are a particularly deep thinker. I will point out. I will mention Sasha Senderovich though, because he constantly criticizes your posts on Twitter, and it's always the same thing. He says this is a stale, worn-out Cold War framework, and and it's unclear whether he's condemning your condemnation of the Soviet Union, or whether it's your condemnation of the anti-Semitism of the left. But he clearly has an issue with you connecting the two. And for him, it's some sort of Cold War mindset that, you know, someone like Henry Kissinger, maybe he's not a great example, but somebody who would be working in American politics in the 1970s or 80s would be spouting. And
possibly, you know, because but the thing about it is that, and I know that during the Cold War, left-wing Jews, the left-wing Jews didn't join the fight for Soviet Jewry. They thought that, you know, like if you look at Jewish currents, which of course we all know today as being the hotbed of Jewish anti-Zionism, but, you know, like in the 70s, they would say, you know, this campaign is a reactionary campaign by right-wing Jews, you know, and a lot of like Jewish publications in the 70s would say Soviet Jews don't need rescuing, which is exactly what Soviet propaganda said. You know, our Soviet Jews are just fine, you know, don't try to rescue them, and they have nothing to do with you. So the left-wing Jews didn't join this cause, which I think in retrospect most definitely shows them to be on the wrong side of history. But today,
yeah, a lot of them migrated to Israel after the collapse. I know that. They ended up leaving and going to Israel.
Who specifically?
Some of these left-wing, you know, allegedly left-wing critics of Israel during the Soviet period.
Yeah, so, you know, I think that when Sasha says this, he probably means to say that, yes, I look at it like as if I'm participating in this Cold War propaganda. But the thing is it's not, you know, and I'm often accused of being kind of a typical right-wing Soviet Jews, which I find really funny. I've never been right-wing. I've always voted Democrat, and I've always been a liberal. I mean, I'm still a liberal.
Liberal is fascist in today's left-wing discourse.
That's exactly it, you know. And so they say, well, this is, you know, I used to actually, in fact, I used to be one of those, I think the Soviet Jewish political opinion used to be split at some point 75-25%. So 75% Republican, 25% Democrat. So I was always in the 25%. And I used to kind of, you know, crack up at my fellow Soviet Jews, conservative, and not just conservatives, but yes, sometimes kind of a paranoid you know, screaming that, you know, the Democrats are communists. So I used to just laugh at that too. But today, in fact, we do see the left has become so radical, you know, that it's not even, it's not even an exaggeration. They actually call themselves communists. So, you know, so I base what I say on research, you know, it's not ideological. I look at what I've looked at a lot of material. And so that's what drives what I say.
Yeah, in terms of what Jews said publicly, like the intellectuals who still had a space to be intellectuals, you know, I looked at a few guys in Odessa. I was reading through the newspapers, you know, throughout, you know, and in, you know, the Brezhnev era, really, you know, the era, the peak of stagnation. There was a humor column in one of the local papers in Odessa. I forget if it was Znamya Kommunizma or the other one. But you know, they published it was thinly veiled Jewish satire, right? They couldn't say anything specifically Jewish, and I show in my book what makes it Jewish. And I remember out of the blue in the late 1960s, probably 67, 68, coming up with an article written by the three satirists who did the column, just denouncing Israel completely out of the blue, saying we utterly condemn Israel, we have nothing to do with them, etc., etc. And I have no doubt that someone above them said, you better be writing this. You know, whatever their personal views on Israel might have been, which might have been indifference. Though I heard one of them definitely did move to Israel afterwards. But they were forced to denounce it. There were definitely people above, and that shows, you know, a litmus test that we're going to be subjected to. And that's another thing with today's left, the constant litmus tests that Zionists are being subjected to in the United States.
I don't want to get into a tangent, but I don't understand why so many people, maybe even yourselves, didn't see this coming with the left a long time ago. The left, even the mainstream left, has for a very long time been concerned with inequality and differences in power dynamics and structuralism, and the belief that the government needs to do more to, you know, to give positive rights to people, to create equalities. I mean, the writing was on the wall for a long time that it would evolve into this kind of radicalism.
I should point out that Adam's more conservative than I am. Adam's more conservative than I am, and for me, the late 1960s, and they talked about all that stuff that he just mentioned. I don't see anything wrong with the way.
Read the Port Huron statement. which was in the 1960s.
Well, I'm not going to go out and support the Weathermen or people like that. I mean, I'm not, that radical, but I mean, I think there's a big leap that took place from the original civil rights struggle to what we see today. I mean, I don't think it was the inevitable outcome.
I think it was, but that's a debate for another time.
But it's true that 20 years ago, the writing was there for sure.
And I wasn't paying enough attention to that, I would say, to really think otherwise, or to think that it might be threatening. I think that what I did see a few years ago when I started paying attention to the growth in the anti-Zionist rhetoric is I did warn that we will get to a point, or we are under threat of getting to a point where Jews will experience the kind of discrimination that they experienced in the USSR, maybe not to the degree that they will not be able to study Hebrew, for example, or go to the synagogue, but there could be professional and educational discrimination. And those signs began to appear already several years ago. Like all of a sudden, I started hearing from friends that they couldn't publish their books that were maybe pro-Israel or not explicitly anti-Israel, right? Suddenly you started to see these signs coming from universities. And so that's, I have to say, something that I warned about. But I mean, even so, after October 7th, what I did not see at all is that our educated elites would come out for Hamas. I did not see it. And I think that that's maybe, Adam, going to the question of because that's not just anti-Zionism. There's something else there. Obviously, there is a broader ideology. I mean, it's not like the kind of anti-Zionism that comes from the USSR. It's more than that. It's
Western guilt.
Well, Western guilt or whatever, it's become almost a cliche to say now that it's the division of the world into the oppressor and oppressed. Whatever ideology is called that has created that has made it possible. That I certainly did not foresee. I couldn't have foreseen complete silence by women's organizations about the mass rape of Israeli women on October 7th, right? So there's so much. I mean, it's just been shocking the last 2 months.
Once you're labeled as a Zionist, you've lost all, not only respect, but sympathy for anything on the left. It's a given. And I saw that with Jewish Voice for Peace in 2017, when they attacked gay Orthodox Jews at an Israeli Pride parade or an Israeli Day parade in New York. They literally went after the gay Orthodox Jews because they knew they were.
I just seem to. My problem is that I think a lot of people have poor memories. Like I was an undergraduate in the 1990s, and the same exact rhetoric that we're hearing now, I was exposed to in the classroom as an undergraduate in the public university that I went to in the 1990s. I was a graduate student during the Second Intifada, and the apologetics for what was going on is virtually the same as what we're seeing now.
Really?
I don't really understand why people think that this is some sudden new phenomenon taking place.
Social media plays a role.
Yeah.
And it's increased exponentially. Even before Trump came to power, but with Trump, I think there was also more of an exponential leap.
I'm not so sure, but you might be right.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just become a lot more obvious in the last decade. Even when I was in grad school at Berkeley.
After 9/11, there were all kinds of apologetics for the terrorist attack that happened on the United States.
Yeah, but not to the extent you see it today. No, I mean, it's far more today than it was then.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess it depends upon what circles you run in.
Well, we've passed the hour mark, and in this case, it was certainly well worth it. This was an absolutely terrific episode. We got a deep delve into Soviet history, especially the post-war era. I do want to give one last shout out to Murat Grinberg's book, not just because I wrote a review that's coming out, but he has an interesting take on anti-Zionism in the USSR there, and about how Jews consumed the anti-Zionist propaganda because it was actually a way of, reading between the lines and learning about Israel, right? As the Soviet government was vilifying Israel, they were actually giving information about Israel, about how the Six-Day War transpired, about how the IDF worked internally in the different ranks. And it actually, he argues, increased Jewish pride in many respects. So I do recommend.
It's a great book.
Yeah, I recommend that book. I recommend all of Izabella's writings, absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me. It's fun. I've been watching your episodes and always thought that you're just a fun duo doing some really fun conversations. So great to join you for it.
Thank you very much.
And you're just doing really important work with the network and standing up to all of this anti-Zionist nonsense.
The
It's
fact
so
that,
dangerous.
I'm so hated in certain circles of Jewish studies, confirms that I'm doing the right thing, especially who the people are concerned.
Absolutely.
Shout out to
Absolutely.
Omer Bartov once again for winning the Shmigagi of the Year. Mazel tov.
Excellent choice.
It's well
I
deserved. It's well deserved. All right. Well, this is
Okay.
Jarrod, Adam, and Izabella signing off.
Goodbye.
Thank you.